Hi, Paul Thompson here. I'm going to talk about low brass and horns today. Arrangement tips, how you might use them. If you're not familiar with them or, massively familiar with them, I'm going to give you some ideas about how you might use them in your productions, in your compositions. There's quite a lot to get through, so let's dive straight in. I'm going to start with, as you can see, I've got the BBC Symphony Orchestra violas and the horns A4 loaded up. So I'm going to start with that doubling. Now, when I say A4, this simply means there are 4 players and they're all playing the same note. They're all playing in unison. So let's start with that and see what that sounds like. Now you can hear here that the horns are really kind of taking over the sound. The violas are really a little bit weak. So if we add in the cellos as well. Now I'm going to add these in what I'm calling at pitch. So I'm going to add them in playing the same note, and then we're going to split them off by an octave just to see what effect that has. Now you can hear that you've got more power in the string section, so the horns are slightly better balanced. But what happens if we try moving things around by an octave? So first up, I'm going to take the cellos and I'm going to transpose those down an octave. Now this is just a MIDI transpose. All it's doing is it's taking the note I'm playing on the keyboard and it's moving that down an octave. So what we're going to hear now is the violas and the horns, and then the cellos will be playing an octave below them. Okay, so that's already got a different sound. Now what happens if we sit the cellos back at pitch, so they're at the same pitch as the horns, and then we put the violas up an octave? Okay, it's interesting. I mean, these are all just options that you might experiment with. For me, that one's not quite as successful. It sounds a little bit odd, a little bit kind of disconnected. Now, there is one more thing I want to check, which is what happens if you put the violins about an octave above the horns. Now, that is quite a nice sound. I'm going to put both of our violin sections to transpose up an octave. Let's get them both in record and the horns at pitch. And check out what this sounds like. Now this is a much more successful pairing to me. Why is that? Why did it not work as well with the violas, but now it's working better with the violins? Well, I think it's because they're more timbrally balanced in their ranges. What do I mean by that? If you consider an instrument, it has a kind of sweet spot where you might think that when you're learning an instrument, that area, it's often in the middle of the range of the instrument, is the kind of easiest area to play. Now if you follow that through to an accomplished professional, what that really translates through to is that singing range of the instrument is in that sweet spot. With the horns, they sound really, really great around, middle C and maybe an octave each side. And then as you go higher than that, you're really kind of punching out into the kind of what we call the gods, up into the real high register, where it's very hard to play quietly, but it sounds great punching it out loud. It's not quite so great for these kind of singing phrases, these kind of melodic motifs. Now, if you look at the way that an instrument is written, quite often they have different clefs, and the reason for the different clef is to make it easier to read for the player. But actually the effect that it has, which is quite interesting, is that when you look at the range of the timbre of the instrument, the sound of the instrument, within the lines of the clef that they're written in, they quite often match up quite well across the instrument groups, because that tends to be the middle range of the instrument, the singing range, that kind of general all-purpose area. Now, obviously I'm simplifying slightly, but it's a great starting point. Now, Instruments sound different when they're played together. So what we were just listening to is 4 horns playing unison, all playing the same notes. What happens if we take a single horn and we play with the cello? So we're going back to our original idea. And what about 2 horns? Now the sound hasn't really changed a lot, but you do get a slightly more dense sound with 2 players. Now, it's useful to have these sounds because there is a difference between playing 2 individual solo parts together on your keyboard and what happens when the 2 players are sitting in the room playing together. It is a different sound, and the reason for that is that the sound waves that are emanating from the instruments not only kind of mix and blend in the room and change the way that the room is resonated that you're recording in, but also they have an effect on the bodies of the instruments themselves. Now there's an interesting thing, which is that horn parts are often written when they're doubling. 1 and 3 play together and 2 and 4 play together. Why is this? Well, I've been given 2 different explanations over the years by horn players. One of which is that it's all about intonation. The players are sitting in a line. Now, if you imagine that player 1 and player 3 are playing the top note of a 2-part chord, and players 2 and 4 are playing the bottom notes, it enables them to hear the sound around them and to tune more accurately to the other players. Whereas if you had 1 and 2 and then 3 and 4, the players on the very ends are quite a long way away from the sound of the other note. Now, that's one explanation. I have heard another explanation. I don't know whether this is whether horn players would scoff at this. I will find out. And if you're a horn player, let me know in the comments below. But also, if you are playing very loud and very high, the physicality of it, the projection of the sound waves coming slightly towards the next player along, means that it can sometimes be hard for the second player to maintain a very tight, high embouchure playing loud. So it's simply to isolate the 2 players who are playing the very loud top note a little bit further away from each other so that they don't interfere physically with each other. Now, I mean, as I say, I don't know, horn players may correct me and say, no, that's absolutely not right. But it's a story that I heard a while ago and I really like it, so I'm repeating it here. Now, what about trombones playing melodies, and how do you double those in melodies? Now, I've got a couple of different options here. You'll find trombone sections traditionally might be 2 tenor trombones, 1 bass trombone, and then if you have a lower extension, it's the tuba, as opposed to the contrabass trombone. But quite often you also have 3 tenor trombones and then 2 bass trombones. That's also a very common kind of setup. So let's have a listen to the tenor trombones doubling with the cellos and see what that sounds like. That's a really beautiful sound. The other thing that you can do is, if you want the cellos to kind of soar over the trombones and for the trombones to be a really solid kind of bass for, to use the wrong word for the tenor trombones, for the trombones to be a solid bass for the cellos to sit on, you can split them by an octave. So if we put the cellos up the octave and then play the same notes on the trombone, so effectively it's the same part now, but the cellos are up an octave. So that's an interesting sound. We can reverse it as well. I'll take the cellos down an octave and let's play the same part. Now it's much more the trombones that are featured in the melody. So when you're putting these arrangements together and you're thinking about how you're going to use the brass instruments, one of the things that you also need to take into account is what do you want the listener to be hearing? Do you want them primarily to hear this as, for example, here, a trombone melody, or as a cello melody, and the trombones are really just adding a little bit of thickness to the texture? Now, the final thing that we could look at with the trombones and the strings pairing is to look at what happens when you introduce the basses. So for this, I'm going to use Legendary Low Strings from Abbey Road 1. And this patch has the cellos and the basses in octaves. So we're going to use the trombones and the cellos at pitch. So just to take the trombones out for a moment. So you can hear they're at the same pitch, and then the basses are an octave down. Let's see what that sounds like. Okay, so that's interesting. Now, what I want to do next is to look at the solo instrument. So looking at the solo horn and looking at how you might orchestrate for this or arrange for this on its own. Now, there are a couple of different things that you can do with the horns and the trombones, which are really, really useful. And that is to add weight and texture to other parts. Now, it might be woodwinds that you're orchestrating, or it might be strings, more commonly strings for me. And I tend to write them quite close harmony. So I write the notes close together. I'll explain what I mean by that here. So I'm going to use a relatively low dynamic, if you see the dynamic controller there, which is linked to the mod wheel by default. I've got that down the bottom. So the samples we're playing back are the very quietest samples. I just love the way that these sound. Now you do get a great texture here, and this is really useful for playing this kind of part of sitting behind cellos and things like that. Now, why do I use them in close harmony? Well, you don't have to. There are a couple of different ways to orchestrate. I'm going to show you, let's take that part that I was just playing. Now, if you watch the keyboard here as I'm playing, and then we play the equivalent thing but in close harmony. Now, what do the trombones sound like? Well, let's look at our tenor trombone. We'll put up a solo tenor trombone. And I'm going to use, again, the same low dynamic. And again, getting a kind of close harmony feel. And again, we're in this beautiful kind of really rich area of the instrument. Now, what if we bring the horns in? So we have the tenor trombones and the horns doubling. Now here we've got this, in this range, we've got this lovely kind of chorale sound, and it works at the same pitch in both instruments, which is really useful. And again, if we split them out, they just seem to work a little better for me. I prefer them in close harmony. And it's something that you often don't get with many instruments, where you can write these kind of beautiful, long, slowly moving parts that are kind of rubbing against each other a little bit. It works really well with these instruments, especially down in the bass end, close together. Whereas with some instruments, it doesn't. You get a very muddy sound. And it actually works really well if we push this right up to the top and have the full tilt. It still works well in close harmony. I'll show you. Now, you don't have to do that. You can, of course, get a bigger chord and orchestrate them across the chord. One thing which I wouldn't do is I wouldn't interlock them. I wouldn't worry about trying to make sure that, the lowest note of the horns is lower than the highest note of the trombones. It really honestly doesn't matter. So let's have a look at two close harmony parts. I'll just play these in. And then if we add the trombones. So just to look at those two parts in the score, and I'm going to just change the quantize so we can see more clearly what's going on. Okay, so we've got them both in the bass clef. Now you can see that they are very, they're not trying to interlock or anything like that, and it actually sounds great. It just gives us a slightly wider range to play with. I would tend to always put the horns on top. The horns are really more of a kind of, if you think of choral, if you think of soprano, alto, tenor, bass, I would characterize the horns as more of an alto instrument, and of course the tenor trombones as a tenor instrument. Now let's just have a quick listen to a comparison between the tenor trombone and the bass trombone. Okay, so you can hear that there is a difference, and it's because of the bore of the instrument. So the bass trombone is able to get a more of a kind of a fatter sound down the bottom, and possibly a little bit overall. Now, how does this affect things? Well, let's try. I'm going to show you, and we'll use a kind of middle dynamic. That'll be quite a good one. And I'm going to play a quick 3 parts, just a couple of chords on the tenor trombone, and then I'm going to take the bottom note and put it onto the bass trombone, and you'll see what the difference is. So let's just quickly copy this part down to the bass trombone. Okay, a little bit of tidying up there. Let's make sure we're both set to the same dynamic, and let's have a listen. And the original? So you can see there's not a huge difference there, and what really happens is when you get to the extreme bottom end, you're getting a bigger sound out of the bass than you are out of the tenor. So just to show you that. And the bass trombone. So a much punchier sound down there. So let's go back to the BBC tenor trombone and have a listen to the difference between 1 trombone, 3 trombones, and then more. Three. Now you can obviously go above 3, so we could go for 6 trombones. This is a blend of 3 tenors, 2 basses and a contrabass, all playing at unison. And as a curiosity, here's something that we recorded about 11 or maybe even 12 years ago, which was part of the bespoke library that we recorded, the very first thing that we recorded at Spitfire. And this is 8 trombones. So this, from memory, was 3 tenors, 3 basses and 2 contrabasses. And we called this our Monster Bones. So this was way back in 2010, I think, or 2009. And that sounds like this. So that gets really raucous. And as you can see, we've got our very kind of basic first microphone controls within the library on the front of the patch, as opposed to having to load separate patches. So that was a bit of fun as well. Anyway, coming back to reality, what about these contrabass trombones then? Well, what's the difference? Let's have a quick comparison between the bass and the contrabass. Obviously the contrabass goes down lower, but here's the sound difference. So you can hear there a very different sound. Now it's worth noting when you're writing parts of these instruments, when you're writing for the contrabass trombone, you're writing loud and you're down the bottom end. Some of these notes are basically can last for a second and a half. And that's with a brilliant, brilliant player. Now, writing these long extended notes that, you know, because obviously the sample libraries are looped, just be aware that they are impossible to play. So when you're doing stuff right down there and it's really loud, it uses an awful lot of breath. Now, where would you use the tuba as opposed to the contrabass trombone? Well, they just have a different kind of sound. The tuba is a woollier kind of mammoth type sound, and the contrabass trombone is more of a kind of dinosaur. Don't know why I'm going into that metaphor, but let's have a quick comparison, and I'll change the dynamic so you can hear the dynamic difference. And then the contrabass tuba, which can go an octave down. And that really does rattle the room. It's such a wonderful, wonderful sound. The contrabass tuba is obviously an extension of the brass section down. So it tends not to appear very often in a typical kind of orchestra, but it's really, really useful for film type of orchestration where you do need as wide a kind of range as possible. You really need to be able to kind of make the bottom end chug properly. Now, in terms of voicings, we had our little thing here for the trombones. Let's just have a quick look at the score. So we've got these sections. Doesn't seem particularly happy with that. Let me just quantize that. Okay, so our score view, if you can imagine these two notes here extending into the next bar. I'm going to make this add the top line down an octave. So we've got a 4-part harmony now. I'm going to play that quickly just using the tenor. Okay, check this out. So I'm going to introduce the bass trombone and the tuba for the bottom 2 parts. And taking them all up a little bit of a dynamic. In fact, I'll put some dynamic swells as it plays. Okay, so you can hear that the texture now feels richer, and the reason for that is that you've got these different kind of timbral qualities to the instruments. They have a different voice, and so when you blend those voices together, you get a more interesting sound. Now, this can also work when you're playing things in unison, and here I've loaded up 2 tenor trombones, 2 bass trombones, and the tuba, and we're going to play them in unison, and that sounds like this. Now, of course, I want to try pulling the tuba down the octave first. Pretty nice. What about the bass trombones as well? So let's take them down to the same octave as the tuba. So that's nice as well. Now, they're different colors again. So, you know, it's really to try all of these things out as you're writing, and just try and break free of the idea that, you know, that there is a set way to do all of this stuff. You'll find some things work in context and some things don't. But the beauty of it is that there are so many different colors that you can achieve with the same instruments. It's really, really amazing. When you're layering this stuff into your composition or your production, and all the other instruments are going as well, you'll find that certain things work much better than others. And it's because they are filling out the arrangement in a certain way that is more pleasing to the ear. Now, I just want to go back to the horns, and I've got one last thing to do. So, or rather 2 last things to do, I've just realized. I want to show you the difference between cuivre and bells up. Now, what is cuivre? It means brassy, and typically it's a tightening or slightly constricting of the embouchure. It's a way of playing to get a more nasal sound into the sound that's coming out. It differs from your kind of main sound like this. So here's the normal kind of, you know, long note. And what about cuivre? Now you can hear it's slightly edgier. It's got slightly more of a rasp to it. If I put the close mics in, you really will hear this. And then going back to our main long. It's just a clearer sound. The cuivre, and again, this is a real interpretation thing. So you can, it can take it to, you know, a real extreme, almost, you know, almost to the point of being a kind of stopped sound. And this is a stopped sound with the hand in the bell. And there you really have changed the timbre of the sound so that you have just got those nasal tones, and a lot of the fundamental has kind of dissipated, or the fatness of the sound, not really the fundamental. The fatness of the sound has dissipated, and you're left with this much more constricted sound. Now, the other interesting thing that happens as you do this stopped playing, as you kind of put the hand right up inside the bell, is that the pitch of the instrument changes, and it's often by a semitone. Players will just adjust, so you don't need to worry about writing anything in the parts. As long as you've written stopped, you just write the notes that it's supposed to come out, and the players adjust accordingly. Now, bells up, this is the other thing that I really love. And this is, so if you imagine, it would be good if I actually had a French horn to demonstrate. Oh, I don't play it, so I don't. But if you imagine the horn kind of curls around the body, and the bell is there, is kind of pointed back, almost away from the away from the audience, because the players would be sitting at a slight angle to the audience. The instruction bells up is really to bring the instrument round so that the bell is pointed up into the air, and the sound projects much more directly towards the audience, albeit, you know, bouncing off the ceiling. And that has a very kind of piercing sound. It sounds like this. As opposed to our straightforward long note. You can hear the difference. Going back to it. It's the directionality of the sound has changed, which means that the frequency spectrum that reaches your ears as the audience changes as well, and obviously therefore the microphones. And it works really, really well with these fantastic. You can really punch out these staccato notes. And if we check those compared to our normal staccato notes. So you can hear it's a much more direct sound. I mean, even if we turn this up to kind of match. So try this. And back to our bells up. Even turning that down a little bit. You can hear it's a total mindset change, and it really is. It's the kind of it's the most athletic element of French horn playing. You can really get some excitement into the playing. It's a whole mindset as well as just the sound difference. So the last thing I wanted to show you is what's the difference when you're playing the horns in octave. What's the sound difference between having 2 horns and 2 horns and 4 horns and 4 horns? And I'm going to demonstrate this using the symphonic brass. So let's set this up, and I'll put the second part down the octave. And quietly. And with the Abbey Road 4 horns. And quietly. And again, what you see is that the weight of the extra instruments really adds a kind of density and a solidness to the sound. So that's one of the things that you need to think about when you're arranging for brass, is how many instruments do you want on each part? And sometimes you don't really have much choice. But to give an example, if you're writing a piece that you knew was going to be played and you only have 4 horn players, and you really want that sound that I just played with octaves and the solidness, then don't divide the horns. Find another way to achieve that. So work it out so that you can use all 4 horns on the top part and then put your trombones together on the bottom part. And that's really a kind of guiding light that I would say to really try and keep the sound that you want to hear in your head as much as possible. That's always the way that I try to imagine the sound before I start fiddling around with patches and things like that, just so that I've got a clear idea of what I'm trying to achieve, and then I can try and make the sound that I'm looking at more closely match that. Well, that's been a bit of a dive into some horns and low brass ideas for how you might arrange these instruments. I hope that's been useful, and we'll look in more detail with the brass section by looking at the trumpets in another episode. So thanks very much for watching. If you made it this far, thanks for making it all the way to the end. Click subscribe so that you'll see when I put more tutorials up. There's going to be a lot more coming soon after a bit of a gap from me. And I look forward to seeing you on the next one. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.